They left her with nothing but a child in her arms, her hope as thin as the hunger in her eyes. But when the cowboy brought food, warmth, and finally a ring, it left one question hanging in the air. Was this mercy alone, or the kind of love that could rewrite her future? The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls like the ghosts of forgotten promises, and Celine Hartwell pressed her infant son closer to her chest, feeling his tiny ribs through the threadbare blanket. Ash Hollow wasn't much of a town, just a collection of weathered buildings squatting in the dust like tombstones. But it was all she had left after he rode away with her heart, her money, and every shred of dignity she thought she possessed. The baby whimpered, a sound that cut through her soul sharper than any blade. When had she last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? Time blurred together in a haze of empty cupboards and emptier promises from neighbors who crossed the street when they saw her coming. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had made it clear, "We don't serve your kind here, Missy. Take that bastard child and find charity elsewhere." But there was no elsewhere. No family to return to. No friends who hadn't turned their backs. Just her and little Thomas, clinging to survival in a world that seemed determined to grind them into the unforgiving earth. She stumbled to the cracked mirror hanging by a nail, hardly recognizing the hollow-eyed woman staring back. Her once golden hair hung in limp strands. Her dress, the same one she'd worn for a week, bore stains of desperation and defeat. The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent, and she realized with crushing certainty that she had nothing left to give him. Outside, she could hear the townspeople going about their lives, their laughter and conversations, a cruel reminder of the warmth she'd been cast out from. They whispered about her in the shadows, their voices carrying through thin walls. That Hartwell woman, abandoned with nothing but shame, and a squalling brat, probably brought it on herself. The words hit like physical blows, but Celine had learned to absorb them, to let them roll off her back like rain off a tin roof. What choice did she have? Fighting back required strength she no longer possessed. As darkness crept across the frontier town, painting everything in shades of despair, Celine sank into her only chair, a rickety thing that groaned under even her diminished weight, and wondered if tomorrow would be the day she finally gave up. Before we continue with Celine's story, I need to ask you something. In your heart, do you believe kindness still has a place in a world this harsh? Drop a comment below and let me know, because what happens next might just restore your faith in humanity. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that button now. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this story goes. Colt Branson had seen enough broken things in his 32 years to recognize the look of something about to shatter completely. He'd spotted it in wild horses just before they gave up fighting the rope, in dying cattle during the harsh winter of 2089, and now, God help him, in the young woman standing outside Henderson's general store, clutching a baby like it was the last solid thing in a world gone liquid. He'd been in Ash Hollow 3 days, just passing through on his way to nowhere in particular, when he first heard the whispers. The men at the saloon spoke her name like a curse. Celine Hartwell, the woman fool enough to trust a smooth-talking drifter who'd vanished faster than morning dew when responsibilities came calling. Left her high and dry, old Pete had muttered into his whiskey. Got what she deserved, if you ask me. Should have known better than to spread her legs for a stranger. Colt had wanted to plant his fist in Pete's weathered face, but he'd learned long ago that fighting other men's battles was a sure way to collect enemies. Still, something about the way they talked about her like she was already dead and buried set his teeth on edge. Now, watching her try to trade what looked like a small silver locket for a loaf of bread, he felt that familiar fire kindle in his chest. Henderson was shaking his head, his fat jowls quivering with self-righteous indignation, while the woman's shoulders sagged with each rejection. "Please," she was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was my mother's. It's real silver, I swear it. Just enough for the baby." Take your sob story somewhere else, Missy, Henderson snapped. I run a business here, not a charity house. That trinket ain't worth a plug nickel. The baby's cries pierced the afternoon air, thin and desperate, and something inside Colt's chest twisted tight. He'd been drifting for 15 years, telling himself he didn't owe anybody anything, that keeping to himself was the only way to survive in a world that chewed up good intentions and spat out regret. But watching this young mother's last shred of hope crumble in the dust outside a two-bit general store, Colt felt the walls he'd built around his heart start to crack. His boots rang against the wooden planks as he stepped forward, the spurs singing a quiet song of decision. The woman looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, and for a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "How much for the bread?" he asked Henderson, his voice carrying that quiet authority that came from years of facing down bulls and broncos and men who thought they were tougher than both. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "This ain't your concern, cowboy." Colt reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, letting it catch the afternoon sunday. "I reckon it is now." The cabin Celine called home would have been generous to call a shack 4 walls that had seen better decades, a roof that leaked memories of rain, and a door that hung crooked on rusted hinges. But when Colt Branson knocked on that door 3 hours after sunset, carrying a burlap sack that smelled like answered prayers, it might as well have been the gates of paradise swinging open. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. When she peered through the crack she'd allowed the door to open. "I brought some provisions. Thought maybe you and the little one could use them." Celine's first instinct was to slam the door shut. Men didn't bring food to desperate women without expecting payment of some kind, and she'd already paid more than she could afford once in her life. But then the baby whimpered in her arms, and the smell of fresh bread and salted meat hit her like a physical force, making her knees weak with longing. "I don't have any money," she whispered, hating how her voice cracked on the words. "Didn't ask for any," Colt replied simply. He set the sack down on her doorstep and took a step back. Sometimes a person just needs to eat. No strings attached. She stared at him through the lamplight spilling from her window, searching his weathered face for signs of deception, for the cruel smile that usually preceded demands she couldn't meet. Instead, she found only tired eyes that seemed to understand exactly what rock bottom looked like. When she finally opened the door wide enough for him to enter, Colt moved with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a spooked horse. He unpacked the sack on her small table, bread still warm from the bakery, a wheel of cheese that must have cost a week's wages, dried beef, and miracle of miracles, a small jar of milk. "For the baby," he said quietly, nodding toward little Thomas. "Figure he's probably hungry too." The first bite of bread tasted like hope. Celine tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some shred of dignity, but her body betrayed her with the desperate urgency of starvation. She tore at the loaf with shaking hands, barely chewing before swallowing, while tears she didn't know she was crying tracked down her hollow cheeks. But it was watching her feed the baby that nearly broke Colt's heart completely. She diluted the milk with precious water, testing it on her wrist before offering it to Thomas, with the reverent care of a woman handling something sacred. The baby latched onto the makeshift bottle with desperate hunger, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching as he drank. For the first time in weeks, the cabin fell silent, except for the soft sounds of feeding and the crackle of the fire Colt had quietly built in the neglected hearth. Warmth began to seep into the corners where cold had lived for so long, and Celine felt something she'd thought was dead forever stirring in her chest. As Thomas finally drifted off to sleep, his belly full for the first time in days, Celine looked across the table at the weathered cowboy, who'd appeared like an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to speak aloud. "Why?" she whispered. Colt was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "Because everybody deserves a second chance, ma'am. And sometimes kindness is the only thing standing between a person and the dark. The gossip mill in Ash Hollow ground faster than grain in a windstorm. And by morning, every soul in town knew that the mysterious cowboy had been seen entering the Hartwell woman's cabin after dark. The whispers followed Colt like smoke wherever he went, and the looks ranged from knowing smirks to outright disgust. It didn't take long for her to find another mark, Mrs. Patterson muttered as Colt passed the dry goods store. Some women have no shame at all. That baby ain't even weaned yet, and she's already spreading her legs again, came the venomous reply. Like mother, like daughter, I suppose. Colt's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He'd learned long ago that defending a woman's honor to people who'd already made up their minds was like trying to rope the wind, a lot of effort for nothing gained. But when he stopped at the barbershop for a shave and heard three men laying bets on how long it would take him to get tired of damaged goods, something hot and dangerous uncurled in his chest like a rattler ready to strike. "She's a burden with a baby," sneered Jake Morrison, a rancher's son who'd never done an honest day's work in his privileged life. "Any man fool enough to take her on deserves what he gets. Used goods ain't worth the trouble." "Maybe he likes 'em broken in," laughed Bill Hawkins, slapping his knee. "Some men prefer a woman who knows her place." The barber's razor had been halfway down Colt's cheek when his hand shot out and grabbed Jake Morrison by the shirt front, yanking him close enough to see every fleck of gold in the cowboy's furious eyes. "That's enough," Colt said, his voice deadly quiet. The entire barbershop fell silent except for Morrison's rapid breathing. "You want to run your mouth about something? You talk about the weather. You mention that lady's name again in my presence, and we'll have a real conversation outside." Morrison tried to puff out his chest, but something in Colt's eyes made him think better of it. He'd heard stories about drifters who'd spent years on the trail, men who'd learned to settle disputes with their fists and guns, and he suddenly remembered that he preferred his face arranged the way God had made it. "Wasn't meaning nothing by it," Morrison mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. "See that you don't." Colt released him and settled back in the barber's chair as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that room understood that lines had been drawn in the dust, and the mysterious cowboy wasn't afraid to defend them. Word spread quickly through Ash Hollow that the stranger had claimed Celine Hartwell as his own, though the truth was more complicated than gossip could understand. Colt wasn't staking a claim on anything except basic human decency, but in a town where compassion was as rare as rain in August, even small kindnesses looked like grand gestures. As the sun set over the dusty streets, Celine stood at her window watching townspeople hurry past without meeting her eyes, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere in this harsh world, a weathered cowboy had decided she was worth defending. And that small spark of hope was enough to keep the darkness at bay for another night. The whiskey burned going down, but not as much as the memories that came with it. Colt sat alone in his rented room above the saloon, staring out at the moonlit street where Celine's cabin glowed with warm light. The bottle on the table remained mostly full. He'd learned long ago that drowning pain only taught it how to swim. 15 years ago, he'd had a different name in a different town, with a woman who'd looked at him like he hung the moon and stars just for her pleasure. Sarah McKinnon had been everything good in a world gone hard, gentle hands that could coax wildflowers from barren ground, a laugh that could make even the darkest days seem bright, and a way of believing in tomorrow that made a man think he could be better than his worst mistakes. They'd planned a life together in that little house outside Abilene, white picket fence, maybe a few children, certainly a future that stretched out ahead of them like a promise written in gold. Colt had worked double shifts at the railroad, saving every penny for the ring he'd special ordered from Kansas City, dreaming of the moment he'd slip it onto her finger. But dreams were fragile things in a world built from iron and steam. The fever took Sarah on a Tuesday in March. Along with half the town, and all the plans they'd made for forever. He'd held her hand as she slipped away, and when they lowered her into the ground 3 days later, he'd buried his heart right alongside her. The ring had traveled with him ever since, wrapped in a piece of her favorite blue dress, tucked away in his saddlebags like a talisman against hope. He'd told himself he kept it as a reminder never to care that deeply again. But late at night, when the whiskey couldn't quite silence the ghosts, he suspected the truth was more complicated. Now, watching the gentle glow from Celine's window, Colt felt something stirring in the ruins of his heart that he'd thought was dead and buried. This wasn't the same wild, desperate love he'd felt for Sarah that had been the passion of youth, bright and burning and ultimately fragile. This was something different, something tempered by experience and loss, something that recognized the deep weariness in another soul and wanted to offer shelter from the storm. The baby's cry drifted across the night air, thin and needy, and Colt felt his chest tighten with something that might have been paternal instinct. Little Thomas would never know his father, would grow up carrying the weight of other men's judgments. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fight them alone. Colt's hand drifted to his saddlebag, feeling the small, hard shape of Sarah's ring through the worn leather. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd decide what kind of man he wanted to be in this broken woman's story. "You don't have to do this," Celine said for the third time, standing in her doorway watching Colt examine the rotting timber that passed for her roof beam. The baby bounced in her arms, gurgling contentedly now that his belly was consistently full, but her face remained tight with suspicion. "I didn't ask for your help." Colt tested another board and shook his head when it crumbled under the slightest pressure. "Didn't say you did. But that storm coming in tonight's going to turn this place into a swimming hole if somebody doesn't patch these holes." She'd been watching the dark clouds build on the horizon all afternoon, watching and worrying and trying to figure out where she'd put Thomas when the rain started pouring through the dozen gaps in her ceiling. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, but accepting help from a stranger felt like stepping off a cliff. "What do you want from me?" The words came out harsher than she'd intended, edged with desperation that comes from being disappointed too many times. "Men don't fix roofs out of the goodness of their hearts, not for women like me." Colt paused in his work, hammer halfway to a nail, and looked down at her with those steady eyes that seemed to see straight through all her carefully constructed walls. "What kind of woman do you think you are, Miss Celine?" The question hit her like a physical blow. What kind of woman was she? The kind who'd believed pretty words and empty promises. The kind who'd given her heart to a man who'd taken it and everything else before disappearing into the night. "The kind who makes mistakes," she whispered. "We all make mistakes," Colt said simply, driving the nail home with one solid blow. "Doesn't mean we deserve to drown in them." Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the dusty ground. Celine retreated into the cabin, but she left the door open so she could watch him work. The storm hit like a freight train around midnight, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain hammering against the newly patched roof. Celine lay in her narrow bed, listening for the telltale drip of water through the ceiling, but all she heard was the solid drum of rain on wood. When morning came, bright and washed clean by the storm, she found Colt sitting on her front step, his clothes soaked through. He'd spent the entire night outside, making sure his repairs held. "You stayed," she said, and her voice came out small and wondering. He looked up at her with tired eyes and something that might have been a smile. "Told you I'd fix the roof. It didn't seem right to leave before I knew it would hold." Standing there, looking down at this weathered cowboy who'd kept vigil through the storm just to make sure she stayed dry, Celine felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but blooming. "Come inside," she said softly. "Let me make you some coffee." And when he smiled, really smiled, she felt the sun come out in her heart. The news came with the morning stage driver, who had a talent for spreading gossip faster than wildfire in dry grass. Marcus Hartwell, though he'd never bothered making that name legal, was 3 towns over and asking questions about a woman with a baby, throwing around silver dollars like he owned the mint, and making promises that sounded too good to be true. Heard he's telling folks he's coming back to claim what's his, Pete mumbled into his coffee at the diner, his roomy eyes gleaming with malicious pleasure. Gonna make an honest woman of her after all, he says. Course, we'll see how long that lasts once he gets what he's really after. Colt's hand tightened around his cup hard enough that he was surprised it didn't shatter. He'd seen men like Marcus before, smooth-talking charmers who collected hearts like trophies and discarded them just as easily when something shinier caught their attention. The kind of man who'd view Celine and Thomas not as family to be cherished, but as possessions to be reclaimed when it suited his convenience. You reckon she'll take him back? Asked Bill Hawkins, leaning forward with the eager anticipation of a man watching a dogfight. Woman alone with a baby ain't got many choices, especially when the father's offering to make it right. If she's got any sense, she'll run, growled Jake Morrison, still nursing a grudge from their encounter at the barbershop. Man like that don't change his stripes. He'll stick around just long enough to plant another baby in her belly, then disappear again when the mood strikes. Colt pushed back from the table with enough force to rattle the dishes, dropped a coin beside his untouched breakfast, and walked out into the morning heat. He needed to think, needed to plan, needed to figure out how to protect a woman who might not want his protection, and a baby who'd already stolen a piece of his heart. But first, he needed to see Celine. He found her hanging laundry behind the cabin, Thomas sleeping peacefully in a basket of clean clothes at her feet. She looked up when she heard his boots on the hard-packed earth, and he saw that she already knew. Her face had gone pale as morning frost, and her hands shook as she pinned a tiny shirt to the line. You heard, she said. It wasn't a question. I heard. Colt stopped a careful distance away, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to give her space to run if that's what she chose. What are you going to do? She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but brittle, like glass that might shatter at the slightest wrong touch. I don't know. The admission seemed to cost her something. Part of me hoped this day would never come. Part of me has been preparing for it since the moment he left. She picked up another piece of clothing, a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish. He'll make promises, beautiful ones. He'll say all the things I wanted to hear when I was young and stupid enough to believe them. And will you? Believe them? Celine looked down at her sleeping son, then back at Colt, with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. I used to think love meant accepting whatever scraps someone was willing to give you. That if you just tried hard enough, sacrificed enough, loved enough, you could change someone into the person you needed them to be. She hung the dress with careful precision, smoothing out the wrinkles with hands that had learned to find dignity in simple tasks. I know better now. But knowing better and being strong enough to act on it, those are two different things entirely. Colt stepped closer, drawn by something in her voice that sounded like a woman preparing for battle. You're stronger than you think, Celine. Strong enough to survive when he left. Strong enough to raise Thomas on your own. Strong enough to build a life from nothing but determination and love. Am I strong enough to fight him if he tries to take Thomas? The question came out in a whisper, and for the first time since he'd known her, Colt heard real terror in her voice. Because that's what this is about, not love, not making things right. He wants to claim what he considers his property. Colt was quiet for a moment, thinking about Sarah's ring wrapped in blue silk in his saddlebag, thinking about second chances and the courage it took to reach for them. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a promise. He'll have to go through me first. It happened on a Tuesday morning, while Colt was teaching Thomas to play peek-a-boo, his work-roughened hands covering his face, before pulling away with an exaggerated expression of surprise. The baby had been gurgling and cooing, his tiny fists waving in the air, when suddenly, clear as church bells on Sunday morning, he laughed. Not the hiccuping sounds that babies sometimes make, but real laughter, pure and joyful and utterly without reservation. It bubbled up from somewhere deep in his tiny chest and spilled out into the cabin like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, transforming everything it touched. Celine dropped the dish she'd been washing, her hands flying to her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes. In all the months since Thomas's birth, through all the fear and hunger and desperate uncertainty, she'd never heard him laugh. She'd begun to wonder if children born into such circumstances ever learned how, if joy was something that could be stolen before it ever had a chance to bloom. But here he was, her beautiful boy, laughing at a silly game with a man who'd appeared in their lives like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. His whole face lit up with delight, his eyes crinkling at the corners just like hers did when she was truly happy. And for a moment, the cabin filled with something brighter than sunshine. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. Colt grinned the first completely unguarded smile she'd ever seen from him and tickled the baby's chin. "I heard it, little man. You got something to say about this old cowboy, do you?" Thomas responded with another peal of laughter, his tiny hands reaching for Colt's face with perfect trust. And watching them together, this gentle giant of a man who dedicated his morning to making a baby laugh, and her son, who seemed to have found something in this stranger that even she couldn't give him, Celine felt her heart perform some complicated acrobatics in her chest. This was what she'd dreamed of during those long, dark nights, when pregnancy had been her only companion. Not the wealth or security that Thomas's father had promised before abandoning them both, but this. The simple, profound joy of watching her child discover laughter in the arms of someone who cared about his happiness. "He likes you," she said softly, settling into the chair across from them. "Feelings mutual," Colt replied, but there was something in his voice that made her look closer. His eyes had gone distant, and she caught a glimpse of old pain flickering across his features before he shuddered it away. Every child deserves to laugh, deserves to feel safe enough to find joy in simple things. The weight of unspoken history hung between them, and Celine found herself wondering what losses had carved those lines around his eyes, what dreams had died to leave him drifting alone across the frontier. But before she could ask, his expression shifted, and she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. He was looking at Thomas, the way she'd always imagined a father should look at his child, with wonder and protectiveness, and a fierce, uncomplicated love that needed no explanation or justification. And when he glanced up and caught her watching, the tenderness in his eyes included her too, wrapping around them both like a warm blanket against the cold. "Celine," he said quietly, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her pulse flutter like bird wings. "There's something coming. Word in town is that that Thomas's father might be heading back this way." The laughter died in the cabin as surely as if someone had snuffed out a candle. Thomas, sensing the shift in mood, made a small sound of distress and reached for his mother with grasping fingers. But even as fear tried to claw its way back into her heart, Celine found herself looking into Colt's steady eyes and thinking that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face whatever was coming alone. Marcus Hartwell rode into Ash Hollow with all the swagger of a man who thought the world owed him something. Handsome and polished, he looked more suited to city lights than frontier dust, his smile wide, his boots gleaming, his eyes sharp with entitlement. Colt watched from the saloon, noting how Marcus's gaze swept the town like a king reclaiming his throne. Word had it he'd struck silver in Colorado, rich enough to buy back what he once threw away. And sure enough, he rode straight to Celine's cabin, calling out her name as if she still belonged to him. Celine stepped outside, Thomas in her arms, her face calm but guarded. "Marcus," she said flatly. "Still as beautiful as ever," he crooned. eyes flicking to the boy with a calculating gleam. Our son looks strong. He'll do well. He's not yours to claim, Celine replied, her voice firm. Marcus's charm never slipped, though his eyes turned cold. I've come to make things right. I've money now, enough to take care of you properly. We can be a family, just like we planned. Celine shook her head. We never planned. You promised, then left when it mattered. He stepped closer, voice lowering like a predator circling prey. I was young, but I've changed. I can give you security, respectability, a real name for the boy. His name is Thomas, she said sharply, and he's already got more respect than you'll ever earn. Before Marcus could reply, Colt stepped forward, placing himself between them. She's not throwing anything away, he said evenly. She's choosing. Marcus sneered. And who are you, cowboy? Someone who knows love isn't possession. Colt pulled a small silk bundle from his vest and placed it in Celine's hand. Inside lay a delicate ring, catching the afternoon light. This belonged to someone I once loved. Love isn't about claiming or owning, it's about choosing to stay, even when it's hard. Celine, I love you, and Thomas. I'm asking you to marry me. Not out of obligation, but because I want to build a life with you. For the first time, Marcus's charm faltered, rage twisting his face. You think you can steal what's mine? She was never yours, Colt said quietly. Neither was the boy. People aren't possessions. They can only be loved. Celine looked down at the ring, then at Colt, the man who had stood by her when no one else had. Her voice was steady as she said, Get off my property, Marcus, and don't come back. Marcus's threat came sharp and bitter. You'll regret this. Colt's voice was low, dangerous. I might want to remember so I don't forget, either. Beaten, Marcus mounted his fine horse and stormed out of town. Celine clutched the ring, her heart steady now. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Colt's smile was quiet, full, and true as he slid the ring onto her hand. Thomas giggled and reached for the sparkling stone, and for the first time, Celine knew she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, as the first snow dusted the peaks around Ash Hollow, Celine Branson, now proudly wearing her husband's name, watched from the kitchen window as Colt taught Thomas to walk. The boy, nearly a year old, toddled toward his father with wobbly steps, laughter spilling out each time Colt caught him in his strong arms. The cabin, once a shelter of desperation, had become a home alive with warmth. Thomas's giggles, Colt's quiet humming, and Celine's voice singing old songs she thought she'd forgotten. Even the townsfolk had softened. Mrs. Henderson saved them the best cuts of meat. Pete tipped his hat, and Jake Morrison admitted he'd been wrong. When Thomas pointed proudly and called, Mama, Celine felt her heart brim over. This, she realized, was what love looked like, not gifts or pretty promises, but Colt, rising before dawn to milk the cow, or teaching Thomas to stack blocks with patient joy. Love was the ring he'd placed on her finger freely, and the way he claimed Thomas not as another man's child, but as their son. The door opened with a rush of cold air as Colt and Thomas came in, cheeks flushed from the snow. He wrapped his arms around them both, smelling of wood smoke and winter air. How are my favorite people? He asked. Perfect, Celine whispered. As the fire crackled and Thomas played at their feet, Celine thought of the woman she once was, frightened, hopeless, certain her story had ended. But Colt's steady love had proven otherwise. This wasn't an ending at all, it was a beginning. When Colt caught her watching him, she smiled. Just thinking how a story can feel finished, when it's really only just begun. He pulled her close, kissed her gently, and promised, Our story's just getting started. And as the snow fell outside, the Bransons settled into a night of warmth and belonging, living proof that second chances can write the happiest of endings. If you thought this story of love conquering abandonment was incredible, Wait until you see what happens in our next video.